What you're about to hear is not dry textbook philosophy. It's the life of a man who wrestled with truth in courts, classrooms, and exile. A man born under minarets in Córdoba, raised in the libraries of Al-Andalus, and remembered not in his own homeland, but in the lecture halls of Europe. His name was Ibn Rushd, Averroes to the Latins, the last great Aristotelian of Islam, the bridge no one asked for but history couldn't do without. This isn't a sermon, and it's not a lecture. It's a guided walk through his world, his doubts, his methods, his fights, his failures, and his strange second life centuries later. You'll hear how reason and revelation clashed, how politics broke philosophy, and how one exile's books outlived empires. If you care about the tension between faith and reason, the battle between power and truth, or the question of whether philosophy has a place in religion, you're in the right place. And if you want more journeys like this, more lives, more ideas, more brutal honesty about the people who shape thought, then do the simple thing. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and share this with someone who thinks philosophy doesn't matter. Because it does. It mattered then, it matters now, and it'll matter as long as human beings keep asking questions too dangerous for comfort. Part 1. The Birth of Reason's Defender. In the sweeping landscape of Islamic intellectual history, few figures stand as defiantly luminous as Abu al-Walid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd, known in the Latin West as Averroes. Where Al-Ghazali became the voice of doubt, spiritual awakening, and integration of faith and mysticism, Ibn Rushd emerged as the bold champion of reason, logic, and philosophical clarity. He was the philosopher who refused to let rational inquiry bow its head in submission, even when the tide of religious orthodoxy threatened to drown it. Born in 1126 CE in Córdoba, the glittering heart of Muslim Spain, Ibn Rushd was heir to both privilege and responsibility. His family was steeped in tradition. His grandfather had served as chief judge of Córdoba, and his father followed the same path. Law and theology were the family business, and young Ibn Rushd was expected to continue this legacy. But destiny had other plans. Where most of his contemporaries found contentment within the framework of jurisprudence and theology, Ibn Rushd's restless mind reached further. He wanted not only to interpret the law, but to understand the universe itself. Córdoba at that time was no ordinary city. It was a crucible of civilizations where Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars exchanged ideas, translated texts, and argued about truth. Greek philosophy, especially the works of Aristotle, was available in Arabic, and intellectual debates filled the air like the perfume of Andalusian gardens. Ibn Rushd absorbed it all. His education was exhaustive. Quran, Hadith, Islamic jurisprudence, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy. By his mid-20s, he had already become a polymath. But his true calling was philosophy, and more than that, the defense of philosophy against its detractors. When Al-Ghazali wrote The Incoherence of the Philosophers, shaking the foundations of rationalist thought with his piercing skepticism, it sent tremors across the Muslim world. Philosophers were branded as dangerous, sometimes even heretical. For many, the debate was over. Reason had lost, mysticism and faith had won. But Ibn Rushd refused to accept this verdict. His mission became clear: to rescue philosophy from the accusations of incoherence, to show that rational inquiry was not the enemy of revelation, but its most faithful ally. It was a mission that would consume his life, embroil him in controversy, and ultimately see him exiled and disgraced before being vindicated by history. At first, Ibn Rushd lived the life expected of him. He studied Islamic law in depth and became a respected qadi, judge. His sharp intellect and balanced temperament earned him recognition in the courts of power. But unlike other jurists, he never confined himself to dry legal disputes. He saw in law a reflection of deeper principles, questions about justice, human nature, and divine order. His mind constantly sought the universal behind the particular. A turning point came when Ibn Rushd was introduced to the Almohad court in Marrakesh, where the Caliph Abu Yaqub Yusuf presided. The ruler was curious about philosophy and its compatibility with Islam, but also cautious, for the shadow of Al-Ghazali's critique still loomed large. Ibn Rushd was summoned to discuss Aristotle and the role of reason in religion. His eloquence, clarity, and confidence impressed the Caliph, who tasked him with commenting on Aristotle's works, a monumental project that would define his legacy. What followed was nothing short of heroic. Ibn Rushd dedicated his life to studying, explaining, and defending Aristotle. His commentaries, some short and introductory, others vast and detailed, became the definitive interpretations of Aristotle for centuries, transmitted into Latin and Hebrew, and shaping the course of European philosophy. Thomas Aquinas, Dante, and countless medieval scholars would come to know Aristotle through the voice of Averroes. But Ibn Rushd was not simply a translator or commentator. He was a philosopher in his own right, weaving together Aristotle's ideas with Islamic theology, offering a vision where reason and revelation could not only coexist but mutually reinforce each other. Where Al-Ghazali saw danger in philosophy's overreach, Ibn Rushd saw danger in the abandonment of reason. He argued that the Quran itself commanded reflection, inquiry, and rational analysis. To silence philosophy was not to defend religion, but to betray it. Yet this conviction came at great personal cost. Philosophy was already under suspicion, and Ibn Rushd's bold defenses only deepened the hostility of conservative scholars. Though he rose to high positions, chief judge of Córdoba, personal physician to the caliph, his enemies never ceased their attacks. In his later years, he was denounced, exiled, and his works publicly burned. A lifetime of service seemed undone in an instant. But ideas are harder to kill than men. While Ibn Rushd died in relative obscurity in 1198 CE, his works had already crossed the Mediterranean. In Europe, he was hailed as the commentator, the supreme authority on Aristotle. In Jewish philosophy, his rationalist method inspired generations, from Maimonides to Spinoza. Even in the Islamic world, where his influence waned for centuries, modern thinkers have rediscovered him as a voice of reason, courage, and integration. Ibn Rushd's legacy rests on one central insight. Truth cannot contradict truth. If revelation is true and reason is true, they must ultimately converge. Conflict arises only when revelation is misinterpreted or reason misapplied. His life was a testament to this principle, a relentless struggle to hold faith and reason together in a world determined to tear them apart. The journey we are about to undertake through Ibn Rushd's philosophy will reveal a mind both systematic and daring. We will explore his vision of the harmony between philosophy and religion, his theory of the intellect, his analysis of law and ethics, and his defense of rational causality against the skeptical assaults of Al-Ghazali. We will discover how he wrestled with the deepest problems of metaphysics, psychology, politics, and theology, producing a body of thought that shaped civilizations for centuries. Most importantly, we will see how Ibn Rushd's philosophy speaks not only to his own time but to ours. In an age where faith and reason are often portrayed as enemies, his voice reminds us that both are indispensable, that the human search for truth requires the full use of the mind and the full openness of the soul. This is the story of a man who refused to let reason die, the story of a philosopher who stood against the tide, defended the dignity of thought, and insisted that religion itself demanded nothing less. This is the journey into the world of Ibn Rushd, Averroes, the defender of reason. Part 2. The apprenticeship of law. Ibn Rushd's formation began not with speculative metaphysics, but with discipline, pages of jurisprudence, chains of transmission, and the slow, exacting craft of legal reasoning. Córdoba, his birthplace in 1126, was a city where law was not merely a profession, but the syntax of public life. His family had shaped its courts for generations. His grandfather, a towering Maliki jurist, had been Qadi al-Qudat, chief judge of Córdoba. His father followed in those footsteps. Young Ibn Rushd grew up inside that architecture. Commentaries on Malik's Muwatta, disputes over analogy versus explicit text, arguments about intent, public welfare, and the limits of juristic discretion. Before he learned to speak in Aristotle's terms, he learned to think like a judge. This mattered. The habits of law, define terms, separate evidence from opinion, identify scope, weigh authority, became the bones of his later philosophy. Where others treated theology as license for speculation, he treated it like a case file. What's asserted, what's proven, what follows. He studied fiqh and ushul al-fiqh, absorbed hadith criticism, and internalized a temperament. Calm, exact, suspicious of shortcuts. Even when he moved into the arenas of physics and metaphysics, he carried the jurist's ethic with him. There would be no grand claims without demonstration, no rhetorical thunder standing in for proof. Córdoba's intellectual environment reinforced this method. The city's libraries carried Greek texts in Arabic translation, the works of Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, and the philosophical synthetics of Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina. Scholars argued in private salons and public courts. Almoravid rigor had given way to Almohad reform. Elsewhere, this could have meant a purge of books, but in Ibn Rushd's orbit, it created a pressure test. Only arguments that could stand up to scrutiny survived. He read broadly: logic, mathematics, medicine, astronomy. He learned how the disciplines interlock. Logic guarantees form, mathematics calibrates precision. Medicine forces contact with bodies and causes. Astronomy trains the eye on lawful motion. He disliked fuzz. He pursued clean lines. The apprenticeship moved from libraries to courtrooms. He served as Qadi in Seville, then Córdoba. The cases were not abstractions: property, contracts, injuries, witnesses, intent. Law that fails at causation is cruel. Law that ignores context is blind. Ibn Rushd learned to keep two pictures in focus: the universal rule and the particular life. He refused to let either swallow the other. This balance shaped his later insistence that scripture and demonstration speak to the same reality from different registers. A judge learns quickly. When two testimonies seem to conflict, the failure is often in interpretation, not in truth. The decisive encounter came through Ibn Tufayl, philosopher, physician, author of Hayy ibn Yaqan, and advisor at the Almohad court. Ibn Tufayl recognized in the younger jurist a mind that could carry a heavier load. He brought Ibn Rushd to Marrakesh and presented him to the Caliph Abu Yaqub Yusuf. The Caliph had a problem that was also an opportunity. The Islamic West was flush with philosophical texts, but its discourse was scattered, often derivative, and increasingly embattled after al-Ghazali's broadside. If philosophy was to serve the polity instead of confusing it, someone had to rebuild Aristotle: clear, faithful to the text, rigorous enough to withstand theological attack, and calibrated for a community with prophecy, law, and worship at its center. The assignment was enormous. Produce short, middle, and long commentaries on Aristotle's corpus. Short, digest for beginners. Middle, analytical paraphrase. Long, line-by-line exegesis with arguments and objections. It was not celebrity work. It was infrastructure. Rebuild the logical organon so that demonstrations are genuinely demonstrative. Pull metaphysics back from speculative drift. Keep physics tethered to causes and observation. Rescue psychology from mist and rhetoric by anchoring it in sensation, imagination, intellect, each with a scope and a job. Even while climbing that mountain, Ibn Rushd practiced medicine and adjudicated law. In medicine, he compiled the Kulliyat, the generalities, later the Collegiate, a systematic treatise on principles rather than recipes. In law, he wrote Bidayat al-Mujtahid wa Nihayat al-Muqtashid, not a cookbook of rulings, but a map of disagreement, where schools diverge, why they diverge, and which evidences bear decisive weight. The style is consistent across disciplines. He doesn't hide the seams. He makes the reader watch him sort premises, grade proofs, and mark limits. It is pedagogy through exposure to method. The context remained dangerous. Many jurists distrusted philosophy not from ignorance, but from experience. Imported systems had been used to bulldoze revelation or smuggle in alien premises under Arabic terms. Ibn Rushd understood the complaint. He agreed that private metaphysics masquerading as demonstration was a toxin. His answer was not retreat, but tight calibration. Aristotle read accurately. Demonstration used only where it applies. Dialectic and rhetoric respected in their lanes. Ambiguous scriptural texts interpreted only when genuine demonstration forces it. The rest left as the community receives it. This is the pedagogical firewall that would later form the heart of his decisive treatise. The apprenticeship of law trained him to accept burden of proof. If you claim eternity of the world by necessity, show the necessity. If you deny secondary causes, explain how medicine and agriculture work without them. If you interpret a clear text, demonstrate the compulsion, otherwise you're performing surgery on a healthy body. He would tolerate complexity, not confusion. He would engage opponents on the ground that matters, method. He was not interested in winning by volume. He wanted a polity built on reasons that hold. He refined another habit in this period: audience discipline. In court, you tailor explanations to the parties present. A legal syllogism given to a farmer in technical Greek logic is cruelty, not clarity. A soothing parable given to a panel of jurists is evasion. In philosophy, the same applies. Burhan, demonstration, binds the trained. Jadal, dialectic, persuades the learned public. Kitaba, rhetoric, guides the many. Mixing these corrupts minds and destabilizes faith. The early sermons he delivered and the opinions he wrote show a man who could speak in each register without cheating any of them. Later critics called this elitism. He called it precision and care for the community. Through these years, Ibn Rushd refined his central conviction into a rule. Truth is one. If a result produced by genuine demonstration seems to conflict with revelation, either the demonstration is not genuine or the reading of revelation lacks discipline. A judge knows the pattern. Two credible witnesses can be reconciled by context and qualification. Contradictions often dissolve when someone stops forcing a literalism where the speaker never intended it. He would carry this rule into every major work, commentary, treatise, polemic. His apprenticeship also hardened him against two temptations that ruin thinkers. The first is overreach, extending a method beyond its domain because it worked well somewhere else. He refused to turn metaphysics into a substitute theology, or theology into a blunt instrument against physics. The second is cowardice, abandoning a valid conclusion because it is unpopular. He would not declare that fire doesn't burn by nature in order to flatter an occasionalist mood. He would not turn every miracle into a metaphor to appease rationalist fashion. He insisted on order with room for exception, not exception as the rule and not rule as iron. By the time he left the apprenticeship stage, the outline of his mature system was visible. Law taught him to structure disputes and to respect text without surrendering reason. Medicine taught him that bodies obey patterns and that effective action presumes causes. Philosophy taught him that demonstration has jurisdiction and that staying within it is a virtue, not a weakness. Theology taught him caution with speech about God and seriousness about audience. Politics taught him that truth travels through fragile institutions, and that method is not a luxury. It is public safety. He was ready to build. The next movement in his life would push him from judge and physician into the role that would define his name for centuries, the commentator. But before the commentaries came the decision, a compact statement of why philosophy belongs inside a religious civilization and how to keep it from burning the house down. Part 3. The Decisive Treatise. The decisive treatise on the relationship between philosophy and religion was not Ibn Rushd's longest work, nor his most technical, but it was the one that cut to the bone of the cultural crisis around him. Written in the 1170s, when the suspicion against philosophy was thick in the air, it functioned as both manifesto and legal opinion. Where his commentaries on Aristotle reconstructed the architecture of Greek thought, the Fashl al-Maqal, decisive treatise, established the jurisdiction of philosophy inside Islam. It asked a blunt question: is the study of philosophy permitted, forbidden, or obligatory under the Sharia? Ibn Rushd answered with the calm ruthlessness of a jurist. He began with Quranic verses themselves. Repeatedly, the Quran commands believers to reflect, to observe the heavens and the earth, to reason about creation. The Quran itself calls these processes itibar, inference, drawing conclusions from signs. If the law commands reflection, and philosophy is nothing more than disciplined reflection with rules of inference, then philosophy is not only permitted, but obligatory for those capable of it. He went further. The law divides obligations according to capacity. Just as medical knowledge is required of some to protect the health of all, philosophical knowledge is required of some to protect the intellectual health of the community. Those who can perform demonstration, burhan, must do so. Those unable should not attempt it, lest they mislead themselves and others. But they must also not forbid those who can, for to block a community's physicians is to leave the sick untreated. The treatise then tackled the types of discourse. Ibn Rushd identified 3 layers. 1. Rhetorical persuasion, kitaba, stories, parables, images, suitable for the many. 2. Dialectical reasoning, jadal, arguments from widely accepted premises, suitable for theologians and jurists. 3. Demonstration, burhan, strict syllogistic reasoning from necessary premises, suitable only for the philosophical elite. Revelation speaks to all three layers. The same verse may carry rhetorical comfort for the farmer, dialectical argument for the theologian, and demonstrative confirmation for the philosopher. The sin lies not in the Quran, but in confusing audiences. A preacher who throws subtle allegories before an untrained audience corrupts faith. A philosopher who hides demonstrative conclusions from the trained cripples truth. Each level has its dignity. Each must be protected. Then came the sharpest blade, apparent contradiction between reason and revelation. Ibn Rushd's principle was uncompromising. Truth does not contradict truth. If demonstrative proof establishes something beyond doubt, and a literal reading of Revelation seems to oppose it, then the reading, not the revelation, must yield. Scripture contains verses that are clear, muhkamat, and verses that are ambiguous, mutashabihat. God himself says so, Quran 3:7. Philosophers are obliged to interpret the ambiguous in light of the clear and in light of demonstration. To do otherwise is to accuse revelation of falsehood or to degrade reason into sophistry. This was a dangerous claim, but Ibn Rushd framed it as obedience to the law itself. If the law commands demonstration, then ignoring demonstrative conclusions is disobedience. If the law contains ambiguity, then refusing allegorical interpretation where it is compelled is negligence. Far from rebelling against Sharia, philosophy becomes its most disciplined servant. Critics had accused philosophers of undermining religion. Ibn Rushd turned the accusation back. Those who forbid philosophy undermine religion by making it look irrational. If revelation is made to contradict what has been demonstrated, believers will eventually be forced to choose between religion and knowledge, and in that choice, many will abandon religion. The antidote is not suppression, but integration. Teach each according to capacity, interpret carefully, never pit God's book against God's world. The decisive treatise was both legal reasoning and strategic doctrine. Ibn Rushd was a jurist to the end. He cited Quran and Hadith, structured the argument like a fatwa, and weighed objections like a court case. But it was also the cornerstone of his life's project, securing philosophy a legitimate, even obligatory seat inside the House of Islam. For opponents, this was clever subversion, the philosopher wearing a jurist's robe to smuggle Aristotle under the arm of the Quran. For allies, it was rescue, a way to prevent the collapse of intellectual life under the weight of suspicion. For Ibn Rushd himself, it was simply consistency. Law commands reasoning. Philosophy is reasoning with discipline. Therefore, philosophy is law obedience. He saw no gap, no trick. The political climate made the treatise urgent. The Almohads were reformers, zealous about Tawhid, divine unity, wary of innovations, and suspicious of scholars who strayed too far. But Abu Yaqub Yusuf, the caliph, had a taste for science and philosophy, if contained, disciplined, and useful. Ibn Tufayl, his predecessor at court, had opened the door. Ibn Rushd's decisive treatise kept it from slamming shut. It said to ruler and populace alike, this work is not rebellion, it is obedience, not corruption, but purification. From this secure platform, Ibn Rushd launched the heavier artillery, the commentaries on Aristotle. But the treatise remained the pivot. Without it, his commentaries would be exposed, just a jurist moonlighting as a philosopher, vulnerable to every charge of heresy. With it, he had a shield, the Quran itself, interpreted with juristic rigor, commanding the pursuit of demonstration. It was not enough to save him in the long run. Enemies would later strike, and power would shift. But it laid the foundation for his defense across centuries. When Latin Christendom encountered him, it was not only Aristotle they heard, but Ibn Rushd's principle echoing behind the pages. Truth does not contradict truth. In his own world, this treatise marked the transition. The apprenticeship was over. Ibn Rushd, the jurist, had now spoken as Ibn Rushd, the philosopher of law, building a bridge sturdy enough to walk across. The next stage would test the bridge under weight, the great commentaries themselves. Part 4. The Commentaries and Aristotle Rebuilt Lectus. If the decisive treatise was Ibn Rushd's legal defense of philosophy, the commentaries on Aristotle were his philosophical magnum opus, the long labor through which he earned the title the Latin West would give him, the commentator. The task was monumental. Aristotle's works had crossed into Arabic in fragmented translation, often through Syriac intermediaries. They came tangled in layers of interpretation. Al-Farabi and Ibn Sina, Avicenna in the east, Al-Kindi before them, all brilliant, but each bending Aristotle into new shapes. For Ibn Rushd, this was unacceptable. Philosophy had to begin with fidelity to text, not free invention. The job was not to reinvent Aristotle, but to restore him. So he produced 3 kinds of commentaries. 1. Jami, short. Concise digests for beginners, often paraphrasing the central argument. 2. Tawqish, middle. Analytical expositions, unpacking Aristotle's thought and comparing it to other schools. 3. Tafsir, long. Exhaustive line-by-line explanations, weighing arguments, resolving obscurities, supplying proofs. The scope was staggering. Logic, physics, metaphysics, psychology, ethics, zoology, astronomy, he wrote on almost the entire Aristotelian corpus. These texts became the standard route into Aristotle for generations of students in Latin Christendom and Jewish communities. Aquinas called him simply the commentator, in the same way Aristotle was simply the philosopher. But Ibn Rushd was no slavish transmitter. His pen was sharp, his loyalty conditional. Where Aristotle's arguments held, he reinforced them. Where they faltered, he corrected them. Where Ibn Sina had drifted, turning Aristotle's metaphysics into a Neoplatonic emanation system, he cut the drift away. His mission was purification. Aristotle unbent in Arabic clarity, logic, the organ of demonstration. For Ibn Rushd, logic was the immune system of thought. He rebuilt Aristotle's organon for a world that was confusing rhetoric with proof. He separated demonstration, burhan, from dialectic, jadal, and rhetoric, hadaba, warning against their conflation. Logic was not ornamental. It was survival. Without it, theologians mistook persuasive speech for proof, and philosophers mistook speculative models for necessity. Logic disciplined the mind to know when it truly knows. Physics and causation. In natural philosophy, Ibn Rushd fought on 2 fronts, against the mystics who denied causation and against the Avicennian overreach that smuggled metaphysics into physics. For him, causation was real. Fire burns cotton by its nature. To deny this is to empty medicine of meaning, agriculture of method, law of accountability. He acknowledged God as the first cause, but he insisted that God's wisdom works through secondary causes, stable, intelligible, discoverable. Otherwise, the world collapses into miracle theater, unfit for science or law. This stance directly opposed Al-Ghazali's occasionalism, which reduced causation to God's direct, moment-by-moment intervention. Ibn Rushd saw this as intellectual sabotage. If causes have no efficacy, knowledge becomes impossible. Worse, the very commands of the Sharia, to act, to intend, to weigh consequences, lose coherence. Law presumes causal order. Denying it is piety turned against itself. Psychology and the intellect. His most controversial contribution came in psychology, particularly the theory of the intellect. Aristotle had left the subject murky. Ibn Sina had elaborated a doctrine of separate intelligences culminating in the agent intellect. Ibn Rushd tightened the framework. He distinguished carefully between material intellect, the potential capacity in humans to think universal forms, agent intellect, the active power that actualizes thought. But his boldest claim was that the material intellect is one and the same for all humans, a single shared reservoir of potentiality. Individual differences belong to imagination and memory, not the intellect itself. Thought, in its universality, is not multiplied by bodies. This doctrine rattled later readers. In Christian Europe, it birthed the double truth controversy, with some accusing Averroists of claiming 2 parallel truths, philosophical and theological, irreconcilable but coexisting. Ibn Rushd himself never framed it that way, but his insistence on a universal intellect undermined cherished ideas of personal immortality and individual rational autonomy. In Islam, this claim was too radical to gain traction. In Europe, it became dynamite. Metaphysics and God. On metaphysics, Ibn Rushd held firm. The world is eternal in form, created in dependence on God, but not born in time like an artifact. God is not a temporal craftsman, but the eternal cause of an eternal cosmos. Here he broke openly with the orthodox view of creation ex nihilo in time. Yet even here he argued not from rebellion, but from consistency. Demonstration, as he read it, demanded this view, and the Quran's ambiguous verses permitted allegorical interpretation. He accepted the risk because he trusted his principle. Truth cannot contradict truth. Ethics and politics. His commentaries on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics and Politics extended the system into human life. Virtue was not mystical ecstasy, but habituation, training the soul through reason-guided practice. The good life was rational activity in accordance with virtue, sustained in just communities. He admired Plato's vision of philosopher rulers, but tempered it with juristic realism. Laws, not utopias, shape citizens. Justice is achieved not by waiting for perfect rulers, but by building institutions that restrain vice and reward virtue. The commentaries were more than scholarship. They were weapons. Against the claim that philosophy had died under al-Ghazali's critique, Ibn Rushd laid out a system that was not speculative fantasy, but demonstration-driven, ordered, and anchored in Aristotle. Against the theologians who claimed philosophy contradicted revelation, he showed a disciplined method of interpretation where the two converged. Against the skeptics who mocked causality, he gave law and science their foundation back. It was an act of intellectual reconstruction. If revelation is the house of faith, Aristotle was, for Ibn Rushd, the architecture of thought that kept the house standing. Philosophy was not an exotic luxury, it was the structure itself. But structure provokes envy and fear. As his commentaries spread, so did hostility. His brilliance won him enemies as much as admirers. Soon, the controversies would sharpen. The tahafut al-tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence, was waiting. Part 5. The incoherence of the incoherence. Every philosopher inherits enemies. For Ibn Rushd, the greatest adversary was a man he admired but could not accept as the final word, Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Ghazali's Tahafut al-Falasifa, the incoherence of the philosophers, had thundered across the Islamic world in 1095, decades before Ibn Rushd's birth. With sharp logic and theological conviction, Ghazali had accused philosophers like Ibn Sina and al-Farabi of corrupting reason, undermining faith, and holding doctrines so dangerous that they amounted to unbelief. He named three in particular: the eternity of the world, God's ignorance of particulars, and the denial of bodily resurrection. For these, he said, philosophers deserved condemnation. The book left a scar. It intimidated scholars, justified suspicion of philosophy, and shaped the very climate Ibn Rushd grew up in. To do philosophy after Ghazali was to live under indictment. So Ibn Rushd answered with the Tahafut al-Tahafut, the incoherence of the incoherence. It was not a gentle commentary, but a counter-siege, aimed not at mocking Ghazali, but at dismantling his assault line by line. Where Ghazali had taken 20 positions and fired at them with dialectic, Ibn Rushd replied to each with demonstrative counter-argument. The strategy was clear. If Ghazali claimed philosophy collapses under its own contradictions, Ibn Rushd would show that it is Ghazali who collapses, misrepresenting premises, confusing levels of discourse, mistaking dialectical plausibility for demonstration. The eternity of the world, Ghazali had accused the philosophers of denying creation. Ibn Rushd clarified, Aristotle's claim, and his own, is not that the world exists independent of God, but that God eternally causes it. To say the world began in time is to import a human craftsman's model into divine action. God is eternal. His causation is eternal. The world is contingent in dependence, not in temporal origin. He pressed the point. Scripture itself allows allegorical readings for ambiguous verses. If the Quran speaks of creation in ways that seem temporal, demonstration compels interpretation, not denial. Ghazali's objection, Ibn Rushd argued, confuses temporal sequence with eternal dependence. Divine knowledge of particulars. On the claim that God knows only universals, Ibn Rushd rebuked both philosophers who leaned this way and Ghazali's caricature of them. God knows particulars not in the way humans do, through temporal observation, but as their eternal cause. To strip God of knowledge of particulars is error. But to assume that God's knowledge must resemble human knowledge is anthropomorphism. Ghazali, Ibn Rushd argued, had refuted a straw man. Resurrection and the afterlife. Here Ibn Rushd was cautious. Bodily resurrection is affirmed by revelation, and philosophies prove it. Philosophers may have speculated too allegorically, but Ghazali erred by declaring demonstration against them where none existed. For Ibn Rushd, revelation settles what reason cannot penetrate. To claim that reason disproves resurrection is false. To claim that reason proves it demonstratively is also false. It rests on faith, which philosophy has no right to undercut. Causation and natural order. The fiercest battle came over causation. Ghazali had said, "When fire touches cotton, it is God alone who creates the burning. Fire has no real efficacy." To claim otherwise, he argued, limits God's freedom. Ibn Rushd answered with judicial precision, "This is sophistry dressed as piety. God is the first cause, but he acts through ordered causes. Denying natural efficacy makes medicine fraud, agriculture guesswork, law incoherent. Why warn against poison if poison does not kill by nature? Why command treatment if remedies have no effect?" He drew the sharp line. Occasionalism does not honor God. It insults him, reducing his wisdom to chaos and his creation to theater. True majesty lies in laws so stable that science is possible and miracles so rare that they reveal God's exceptional will. Regularity is not a limit on God. It is the expression of God. Method and categories. More devastating than his specific replies was Ibn Rushd's methodological critique. Ghazali had used dialectical and rhetorical arguments, persuasion, plausible objections, analogies, and then presented them as refutations of demonstration. That, for Ibn Rushd, was malpractice. You do not invalidate geometry with poetry or physics with parable. Each discipline has its standards. Ghazali blurred them. This was the heart of the matter. For Ibn Rushd, the collapse of philosophy was not due to its failure, but due to confusion of method. Ghazali had convinced the masses by rhetorical brilliance, but brilliance is not proof. A jurist knows the danger. Eloquence can sway a crowd and still be false. Demonstration stands or falls on premises and necessity, not applause. The wider purpose, the incoherence of the incoherence, was not written only for scholars. It was a declaration of survival. If Ghazali's attack stood unanswered, philosophy would remain crippled. By replying, Ibn Rushd restored balance. He did not deny Ghazali's greatness, he acknowledged his power, but he exposed the limits of his attack. He showed that philosophy had not been destroyed, that demonstration remained intact, and that theology had overstepped its jurisdiction. The aftermath. The work circulated widely. Among philosophers, it was liberation, proof that reason still had defenders with backbone. Among jurists, it deepened suspicion. Ibn Rushd was defending positions already branded heretical. Among rulers, it was a gamble. Philosophy was useful for governance, but politically dangerous when it crossed lines of belief. In the centuries that followed, the book's resonance shifted. In the Islamic East, Ghazali's prestige remained stronger. Ibn Rushd's reply never displaced him. But in the West, through Jewish translators in Toledo, through Latin Averroists in Paris, the incoherence of the incoherence became a rallying point. Here was a Muslim philosopher defying suppression, defending Aristotle, and articulating a principle that Europe would seize upon. Philosophy cannot be destroyed by rhetoric. Truth cannot contradict truth. For Ibn Rushd, the book was both vindication and exposure. He had stepped into the open, fully against Ghazali, no longer shielded by cautious compromise. From this point on, he was not merely a jurist with philosophical leanings. He was the philosopher of Al-Andalus, unafraid to stare down Islam's most celebrated theologian. The cost would come later. For now, the victory was intellectual. He had taken the hardest hit Ghazali had thrown and answered with precision, calm, and relentless logic. Philosophy was not incoherent. The incoherence, he declared, lay in the attack itself. Part 6. The Physician and the Collegiate. If Ibn Rushd had only written on Aristotle and theology, his name would still matter. But he was not just a philosopher, he was also one of the greatest physicians of his age. In medicine, just as in philosophy, his ambition was to organize knowledge, discipline speculation, and ground practice in reasoned demonstration. The peak of this medical work was his Al-Kulliyat fi al-Tibb, Latinized later as the Collegiate, the Generalities. It did for medicine what his commentaries did for philosophy. It stripped away confusion, ordered the sciences, and insisted that knowledge be built on causal explanation rather than rote tradition. General medicine versus particulars. Ibn Rushd distinguished between two levels of medical knowledge. 1. General principles, kulliyat, the universal rules of anatomy, physiology, pathology. 2. Particular cases, juziyat, the diagnoses and treatments for specific patients in specific conditions. The Collegiate dealt with the first, the universals. He argued that without universals, particulars are blind trial and error. Without particulars, universals are useless abstraction. The physician must master both. But by writing the Collegiate, he systematized the general science so it could serve as a foundation for practical medicine everywhere. The body and its functions. He drew heavily on Galen and Hippocrates, but as always, he refused blind repetition. He re-examined anatomy, physiology, and the relationship of organs to their functions. For Ibn Rushd, the human body was not chaos, but an ordered system, intelligible through careful observation and logical inference. The four humors remained central in his model, but he emphasized balance, lifestyle, and environment as key determinants of health, anticipating holistic medicine centuries ahead. Disease and causation. In medicine, as in philosophy, Ibn Rushd insisted on causal explanation. Symptoms are not isolated, they are signs of underlying processes. To treat fever without understanding its cause is to gamble with the patient's life. Just as denying causation in philosophy undermines science, denying causation in medicine undermines healing. Here his Aristotelian realism became practical. Nature has causes, and the physician's duty is to uncover them. Preventive medicine. One of Ibn Rushd's enduring contributions was his emphasis on prevention. Health, he argued, is not merely the absence of disease, but the balanced functioning of body and soul. He recommended dietary regulation, exercise, hygiene, and mental balance as pillars of health. Medicine was not only curative, but civilizational. Healthy citizens build strong societies. This view spread through Latin translations and influenced European medicine for centuries. The Collegiate in Europe. When the Collegiate was translated into Latin in the 13th century, it joined Avicenna's canon as one of the two standard medical authorities in European universities. For nearly 400 years, medical students in Paris, Bologna, Montpellier studied Ibn Rushd as part of their curriculum. He was not just the commentator in philosophy, he became the physician alongside Galen and Avicenna. Medicine and philosophy integrated. For Ibn Rushd, there was no boundary between medicine and philosophy. Both were about the same thing, understanding causes. The physician who relies on chance remedies is no better than the theologian who relies on rhetorical persuasion. Both fail the test of demonstration. In the Collegiate, he argued that medicine, like philosophy, must distinguish levels of certainty. Some knowledge demonstrative, some probable, some merely conjectural. The wise physician, like the wise philosopher, knows which is which and acts accordingly. He also linked medicine to ethics. A physician is entrusted with life itself. Negligence or ignorance is not just error, but injustice. To fail to study causes is to betray the patient. Healing is a moral duty, not just a technical craft. Legacy in science. Ibn Rushd did not revolutionize medicine with new anatomical discoveries the way later Renaissance figures would. That was not his aim. His contribution was epistemological. He clarified how medicine should be studied, taught, and practiced. He gave it the same structural rigor he gave philosophy. He made it a science of principles instead of a guild of recipes. In this, he mirrored his own dual identity: jurist, philosopher, physician. Law, philosophy, medicine all demanded the same discipline: demonstration over rhetoric, causation over chance, universals guiding particulars. The human body, the human mind, and the human community were three layers of the same reality, all requiring order. It was this consistency that made him dangerous. For Ibn Rushd, the universe was intelligible at every level. Revelation, philosophy, medicine all pointed to a world governed by order, not chaos, causes, not whim. That vision threatened not only rival scholars, but the insecure rulers who feared knowledge they could not control. The Collegiate was celebrated in Europe, but in Al-Andalus, it added to his profile as a man whose reach stretched too wide. Jurist, philosopher, physician, was he a servant of the law, or a man who would replace the law with reason? Enemies sharpened their knives. The next phase of his life would show how dangerous knowledge could be when politics turned. Part 7. Politics and the Republic Reimagined. For Ibn Rushd, philosophy was not an ivory tower pursuit. It had teeth, and nowhere more than in politics. Law, medicine, and philosophy all converged in one ultimate arena: the ordering of human beings in community. The individual could not flourish without the city could not stand without justice, and justice could not survive without wisdom. His most daring political work was not even an original treatise, but a commentary on Plato's Republic. The Arabic translation of the text that reached him was incomplete, filtered through centuries of transmission. Yet from those fragments he built a work that bridged Athens and Cordoba, Plato and Sharia, classical philosophy and Islamic governance. Philosophy and law, Ibn Rushd's political philosophy began from a blunt recognition. Most people will never reach demonstrative knowledge. They live on rhetorical persuasion and dialectical habit, not on proof. That is not an insult, but a fact of human nature. Therefore, societies require law to discipline the many, while philosophy guides the few. But law alone cannot be arbitrary command. For him, Sharia itself is political philosophy in divine form. It provides the framework for justice, balancing persuasion for the masses with rational principles for those capable of grasping them. Where Plato had spoken of philosopher kings, Ibn Rushd saw in Revelation the divine equivalent, God's law ruling through wise interpreters. Plato reframed Plato's Republic, proposed guardians, philosopher rulers, and the communal raising of children. Ibn Rushd, writing as a jurist, sifted these ideas through the lens of Islam. Some he rejected outright. Communal wives and children, for example, violated both nature and revelation. But others he transformed. Education. He agreed with Plato that the core of politics is education. Citizens must be shaped in virtue from youth, or the city will rot from within. For Muslims, this meant education grounded in Sharia, but expanded through philosophy and science for those capable. Women. Here, Ibn Rushd was radical. He criticized his own society for confining women to domestic roles. Plato's claim that women can be guardians resonated with him. He argued that women share the same natural capacities as men, and their exclusion wastes half the city's potential. His words are some of the sharpest medieval defenses of women's intellectual and civic equality. Justice. Like Plato, he defined justice as each part performing its proper function in harmony. But unlike Plato, he tied this directly to divine law, which guarantees justice as both earthly order and eternal accountability. The city and its diseases. Ibn Rushd analyzed the pathologies of cities with a physician's eye. Just as the body can sicken through imbalance, the city sickens through injustice. Greed breeds oligarchy. Ignorance breeds tyranny. Uncontrolled desire breeds anarchy. The role of law, and of rulers guided by wisdom, is to diagnose these diseases early and apply remedies before decay becomes irreversible. He compared this to medicine explicitly. Politics is the medicine of souls. A corrupt city is not healed by slogans or rituals, but by systematic reform rooted in truth. Democracy, tyranny, and the philosopher's role. Unlike Plato, Ibn Rushd lived under monarchies, not city-states. His reflections on governance were sharpened by Almohad politics. He saw tyranny as the greatest threat. A ruler who governs for himself, not for the common good, destroys both law and philosophy. But he also distrusted democracy in its raw form, where persuasion sways crowds without reason. The best system, he argued, is law-governed monarchy, constrained by Sharia, guided by philosophers, checked by jurists. Yet he admitted the rarity of philosopher rulers. Just as Plato despaired of the crowd-corrupting philosophy, Ibn Rushd recognized that most rulers lack the patience or discipline for truth. Therefore, he assigned philosophers another role, not rulers, but interpreters and advisors, ensuring that law is understood in its highest light and not reduced to superstition. Politics and ultimate purpose. For Ibn Rushd, politics was not merely about survival or power. It was about directing citizens toward happiness, not pleasure, not wealth, but the perfection of the soul through knowledge and virtue. A society that trains its citizens only for trade, war, or obedience fails them. A just society must orient its institutions toward wisdom. Thus, his commentary on Plato's Republic became more than exegesis. It was a mirror for rulers, a diagnosis of his own time, and a warning. Without philosophy, law becomes blind ritual. Without law, philosophy becomes sterile abstraction. Only their union produces justice. Legacy of the political works. Among Muslims, his political writings never became mainstream. They were too radical, too steeped in Greek categories, too threatening to entrenched powers. But among Jews and Christians, they circulated widely. Latin Averroes in Paris mined them for arguments about the philosopher's independence from theology. Jewish thinkers like Maimonides engaged with his claims about law and philosophy. And centuries later, modern political theorists rediscovered his defense of women, his account of law, his vision of philosophy as civic medicine. Ibn Rushd knew the risks. To write about rulers and justice under monarchs suspicious of free thought was to court danger. Yet he wrote anyway, convinced that truth about the city was as necessary as truth about the cosmos. To heal the soul without healing the society was contradiction. For him, the philosopher had no escape from politics. Philosophy must face the city, or it is cowardice. Part 8. Backlash and Exile. Great thinkers rarely fall because of their arguments alone. They fall because politics shifts. Ibn Rushd had risen high, court physician to the Almohad caliphs, chief judge of Córdoba, philosopher under royal protection. But the same throne that elevated him could crush him when winds changed. The Almohad court. The Almohads, unlike the rigid jurists of earlier dynasties, had flirted with philosophy. Caliph Abu Yaqub Yusuf had summoned Ibn Rushd to explain Aristotle, valuing philosophy as a tool for governance. Under his patronage, Ibn Rushd produced his commentaries, his medical treatises, and his great defenses of reason. To serve such a caliph was both opportunity and shield. But rulers die, and shields break. In 1184, Abu Yaqub Yusuf was killed in battle. His son, Abu Yusuf Yaqub al-Mansur, inherited the throne. Al-Mansur admired Ibn Rushd at first, keeping him as physician and advisor. Yet his reign grew harsher, more defensive, as the Almohad Empire strained under military defeats against Christian kingdoms to the north and rebellions within. Enemies gather. Philosophers rarely make safe jurists. Ibn Rushd's dual identity, qati, judge, and philosopher, made him a walking contradiction in the eyes of many. Traditionalist jurists resented his prestige. Sufis mistrusted his Aristotelian clarity. Theologians despised his defense of eternity, causation, and allegorical reading. They whispered, "He twists the Quran. He prefers Aristotle to the prophet. He denies creation, denies resurrection, denies God's power." Rumor thickened into accusation. What Ghazali had thundered decades earlier, that philosophers deserve condemnation, was sharpened into a blade against him. The fall in 1195, politics provided the spark. Al-Mansur suffered defeat at Alarcos against Castile, a humiliation that undermined his legitimacy. He needed scapegoats, needed to placate the clerics who accused him of tolerating heresy at court. Ibn Rushd was the perfect target, too prominent, too controversial, too exposed. The sentence was swift. Ibn Rushd was banished from court, his books confiscated, his teachings denounced. Some of his works were burned in public squares in Córdoba and Seville, a spectacle of purification, philosophy offered to the flames. He himself was exiled to Lucena, a small Jewish village outside Córdoba, symbolic in its isolation, the great judge reduced to a suspect, the great philosopher pushed out of the city of learning. Humiliation. For a man whose life was order, law, and demonstration, exile was chaos itself. Students scattered, enemies rejoiced. Supporters whispered apologies, but dared not defend him publicly. In Lucena, Ibn Rushd was cut off from the court, stripped of influence, treated not as the commentator but as a heretic. The image spread, the philosopher humbled, Aristotle's champion undone. Books turned to ash. To his enemies, it proved Ghazali's prophecy, that philosophy ends in incoherence and ruin. To his friends, it showed the fragility of truth when politics hardens into fear. Recall and last year's man. Yet even in disgrace, Ibn Rushd was not erased. After a time, Al-Mansur softened, recalling him to Marrakech. Perhaps the caliph regretted the harshness, perhaps he wanted his physician back, perhaps he realized that burning books does not cure defeat. But the damage was done. Ibn Rushd returned weakened, not triumphant. He died in 1198, aged 72, far from Córdoba. His body was carried back to Al-Andalus. Tradition says his coffin was balanced on a mule opposite the load of his books, a grim metaphor. The man and his works, equal in weight, crossing back together. Aftermath. In the Islamic world, his name dimmed quickly. Ghazali remained dominant, philosophy retreated eastward, and jurists held the pulpits. Ibn Rushd's works gathered dust in libraries, remembered more as controversy than guide. In Córdoba, where he had judged, his legacy was silence. But in Europe, the story was different. Translators in Toledo and Sicily poured his commentaries into Latin. Universities in Paris, Padua, Bologna read him as the voice of Aristotle. Aquinas wrestled with him, Siger of Brabant embraced him, Dante would later place him in limbo among the wise. While in Islam, he was suspicion. In Europe, he became the commentator, the indispensable bridge from Aristotle to the West. Lesson of the Fall. Ibn Rushd's exile proves the rule. Philosophy lives or dies not by arguments alone, but by the climates that host it. He had built a fortress of reason, but politics turned the stones to sand. He defended causation, but the cause of his ruin was power itself. Yet even in exile, his principle held. Truth does not burn with books, nor die with the man who spoke it. His enemies silenced him in Córdoba, but centuries later his words roared in Paris. Philosophy for Ibn Rushd was never about victory in the moment. It was about the demonstration that once made cannot be unmade. Part 9. The Latin Averroists. Ibn Rushd died in 1198, a disgraced man in Al-Andalus. But philosophy has strange afterlives. Where one civilization turns its back, another bends down and picks up the torch. His true resurrection happened not in Córdoba or Marrakech, but in Toledo, Paris, and Padua. Translation into Latin. The 12th and 13th centuries saw an explosion of translation in Spain and Sicily. Teams of Jews, Christians, and Muslims collaborated to render Arabic works into Latin. Among the treasures, Aristotle's nearly complete corpus, most of which had been lost in the West for centuries. But Aristotle came not alone. He came with commentaries, and the most penetrating of these were Ibn Rushd's. Gerard of Cremona, Michael Scott, Herman the German, and others translated his long, middle, and short commentaries. By the mid-13th century, universities from Paris to Bologna knew him not as Ibn Rushd, but as Averroes, and Aristotle was unthinkable without him. His name stuck, the commentator, second only to the philosopher himself. The doctrine of double truth. From the translations emerged controversy. Ibn Rushd had insisted that truth is one, reason and revelation cannot contradict, but Latin readers, encountering him through their own disputes with the Church, reinterpreted him. They spoke of the doctrine of double truth, that something can be true in philosophy yet false in theology, and both stand. Ibn Rushd never wrote this, but his sharp separation of demonstrative, dialectical, and rhetorical reasoning made the idea tempting. For radical masters in Paris, it became ammunition against ecclesiastical control of universities. For the Church, it was dangerous heresy. Averroism became a label, sometimes accurate, often distorted, thrown at anyone defending the autonomy of reason. The unity of the intellect. Another flashpoint was Ibn Rushd's interpretation of Aristotle's psychology. He had argued that the material intellect is one and the same for all humans, a single, eternal intellect that individuals participate in but do not own. Individual souls perish, but the intellect endures. This doctrine of the unity of the intellect electrified Europe. To conservatives, it threatened personal immortality, moral accountability, and the Christian promise of eternal life. To radicals, it was liberation. Immortality not as individual survival, but as participation in eternal reason. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas wrote entire treatises against it, De Unitate Intellectus contra Averroistes, insisting that individual intellects exist and survive death. But the very fact Aquinas had to argue proved how powerful Ibn Rushd's voice had become in European debates. Natural causation. Ibn Rushd's defense of natural causation struck deep roots in European science. By rejecting Ghazali's occasionalism, he preserved the Aristotelian conviction that nature follows intelligible laws. This conviction, though eventually overturned in its Aristotelian form, was a crucial step toward the scientific worldview. Without confidence in natural order, there can be no physics, no medicine, no science. Averroes provided that confidence when Europe was starved of it. Radical Averroists. In Paris, figures like Siger of Brabant and Boethius of Dacia pushed his doctrines to extremes. They argued openly that philosophical truth can contradict theological dogma, and philosophy still stands. They defended the eternity of the world, the unity of the intellect, the autonomy of natural reason. The Church condemned them in 1270 and again in 1277. But condemnation could not erase the fact Ibn Rushd had given European scholars the courage to imagine philosophy and into theology. Jewish reception. Among Jewish philosophers, Ibn Rushd's influence was equally profound. Thinkers like Moses Narboni, Gersonides, and even Maimonides wrestled with his commentaries. Maimonides, a near contemporary, shared his commitment to harmonizing reason and revelation, but rejected some of his bolder doctrines. Later Jewish Averroists embraced him more fully, seeing in him a model of rational faith. Legacy in the Renaissance. By the 15th and 16th centuries, Averroes was a household name in Europe's universities. Padua became a stronghold of Averroism. Renaissance thinkers like Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno, and even early moderns like Spinoza inherited his insistence on rational demonstration and the critique of theological limits. His commentary tradition fed directly into the revival of classical philosophy that underpinned the Renaissance. Forgotten in the Islamic world. The irony was bitter. While Europe elevated Ibn Rushd into the curriculum of every serious scholar, the Islamic world largely forgot him. His books gathered dust. His name was invoked more as a warning than a guide. Ghazali remained triumphant. Philosophy retreated into theology and mysticism. The very man who had defended Islam's right to philosophy was remembered in Islam as too Greek, too dangerous, too marginal. Lesson of the afterlife. Ibn Rushd's afterlife proves that philosophy has no permanent homeland. Cordoba cast him out. Paris crowned him. His Arabic words, translated, distorted, debated, ignited controversies centuries after his death. His ghost haunted universities where Latin students called him the commentator, sometimes more faithfully than he could have imagined, sometimes twisted into doctrines he never claimed. But the fact remained. Without Ibn Rushd, Aristotle would not have entered Europe with such force. Without Aristotle, scholasticism and Renaissance humanism would not have unfolded as they did. The man exiled from his own city became a cornerstone of another civilization's awakening. Part 10. Epistemology and the Hierarchy of Knowledge. For Ibn Rushd, philosophy lived or died on the battlefield of knowledge. What counts as true? Who decides? By what method? These were not abstract questions for him. They defined the fate of philosophy under Sharia. If knowledge were collapsed into blind faith or mystical intuition, the philosopher was redundant. If knowledge had no order, chaos reigned. He built instead a hierarchy of knowledge, clear, uncompromising, Aristotelian to the bone. 3 modes of discourse. At the heart of his epistemology was a distinction he hammered relentlessly: demonstration, dialectic, and rhetoric. Demonstration, Burhan, the highest mode, built on necessary premises, proceeding by syllogism, yielding certainty. This is the domain of philosophy and science. Demonstration alone delivers truth. Dialectic Jadal, the middle mode, based on widely accepted opinions, useful for debate and persuasion among the learned, but not yielding certainty. Theologians, Mutakalaman, live here. Rhetoric, Kitaba, the lowest mode, based on images, persuasion, and emotional appeal, fit for the masses. Preachers live here. This tripartite scheme was not new. Aristotle sketched it in the Organon. But Ibn Rushd applied it with ruthless clarity to Islamic discourse. The philosopher's privilege. From this scheme, Ibn Rushd drew a stark conclusion. Only philosophers have access to demonstrative truth. That is not arrogance, but logic. If most people cannot follow demonstration, then most cannot reach certainty. Their knowledge is derivative, mediated by rhetoric or dialectic. Therefore, philosophy is not optional. It is the highest form of worship, the most direct obedience to God's command to reflect and reason. Revelation itself, Ibn Rushd argued, calls the wise to demonstration. To forbid philosophy is to forbid obedience to the Quran's own summons. Allegorical interpretation. But what happens when the Quran, read literally, seems to contradict demonstration? Here Ibn Rushd introduced his most controversial move, ta'wil, allegorical interpretation. If demonstrative proof establishes a truth, say, the eternity of the world, or the reality of natural causation, then revelation must be read in harmony with that truth. The masses should be left with the literal sense, since allegory confuses them. But philosophers are obligated to reinterpret, silently and discreetly, aligning scripture with reason. This was dynamite. To say that philosophers read scripture differently from the masses, and that their reading takes priority where conflict arises, was to invert the authority structure of religion. No wonder jurists sharpen their knives against him. Against Ghazali, Ibn Rushd's epistemology was sharpened by combat with al-Ghazali's incoherence of the philosophers. Where Ghazali had accused philosophers of incoherence and contradiction, Ibn Rushd accused Ghazali of epistemic incompetence. Theologians, he argued, confuse dialectic with demonstration. They parade probable arguments as certainty. They undermine philosophy by standards they themselves cannot meet. This was more than polemic. It was method. Ibn Rushd saw philosophy not as a rival to theology, but as its necessary correction. Without philosophy, theology degenerates into sophistry, endlessly recycling opinions without ever reaching truth. Science and demonstration. His hierarchy of knowledge extended into medicine, astronomy, and physics. Ibn Rushd practiced what he preached. In medicine, diagnosis was demonstration applied to bodies. In astronomy, geometric models must be judged by physical plausibility, not mere prediction. He rejected Ptolemaic epicycles as mathematical tricks, demanding demonstrations rooted in nature. This obsession with demonstration gave him a reputation, even among later Europeans, as severe, uncompromising, almost scholastic in style. But that was his point. Truth is not flexible. You prove it, or you do not. Limits of knowledge. And yet, Ibn Rushd was not naive. He admitted limits. Human reason can grasp the order of the world, the principles of causation, the proofs of God's existence. But it cannot comprehend God's essence. Here, revelation gives guidance beyond reason's horizon. His hierarchy of knowledge was not atheism. It was a ladder reaching toward the divine, each rung distinct but necessary. Epistemology as survival. This framework was not academic, it was survival. In a society suspicious of philosophy, Ibn Rushd needed to argue not only that philosophy was permissible but obligatory. His epistemology made that case. For the masses, rhetoric suffices. For theologians, dialectic helps. For philosophers, demonstration is commanded. Each has its place, but none can usurp the other's role. To let theologians dictate demonstrative truths is tyranny of ignorance. To force demonstrative reasoning on the masses is cruelty. Order is preserved when each mode stays in its lane. Aftershocks. In Islam, his epistemology was largely rejected. Too elitist, too Greek. In Europe, it became ammunition. The separation of philosophical demonstration from theological dialectic fueled centuries of debates about reason and faith, church and philosophy, science and dogma. The double truth controversy was born here, even if Ibn Rushd himself denied it. What he left was a map of knowledge. 3 modes, 1 hierarchy, clear boundaries. A map sharp enough to guide, sharp enough to cut. Part 11. The architecture of reality. Ibn Rushd's metaphysics was not decoration. It was the backbone of everything else, his medicine, his politics, his epistemology. If causation is real, if the world has order, if God exists not as metaphor, but as necessary being, then everything else follows. But if metaphysics collapses, so does science, law, and reason itself. That is why he fought hardest here. God is necessary being. At the top of his metaphysics stands God, the necessary existent. Here Ibn Rushd followed Aristotle's metaphysics but sharpened it. God is pure actuality without potentiality, without composition, without cause. Everything else exists by participation, by dependence. But unlike Aristotle's unmoved mover, Ibn Rushd's God is not aloof. God is the source of being and order for the entire universe, the cause not just of motion, but of existence itself. To deny God is to deny the intelligibility of the world. Eternity of the world. Here came one of his most dangerous claims, the eternity of the world. Ibn Rushd argued that creation is not a temporal event, but an eternal relation. The world depends on God as effect on cause, always and forever. To imagine God starting creation at a moment in time, he insisted, is to make God changeable, reacting to external conditions, a violation of divine perfection. This clashed violently with theological orthodoxy, which insisted on temporal creation ex nihilo. For Ibn Rushd, temporal creation was a concession to rhetorical audiences. For philosophers, the truth is eternal dependence. God eternally causes, the world eternally exists, contingency within necessity. Causation. No doctrine reveals Ibn Rushd's defiance of Ghazali more than his defense of causation. Ghazali had said fire does not burn cotton, God does, directly each time. For Ibn Rushd, this destroyed science. He countered, yes, God is ultimate cause, but God acts through secondary causes, the natures of things. Fire has the power to burn by God's design. Deny that, and you deny the order of creation. This was not philosophy against God. It was philosophy for God. To deny causation is to say God created nonsense, a world without order. To affirm causation is to affirm divine wisdom, that God's world is intelligible and consistent. The soul and immortality. On the soul, Ibn Rushd followed Aristotle, but added his own sharpness. He distinguished between the individual faculties, sensation, imagination, memory, and the intellect. The material intellect, he said, is one for all humans, eternal, universal, impersonal. Individual consciousness perishes, but the intellect remains. This doctrine, the unity of the intellect, was the most explosive of his career. For theologians, it annihilated personal immortality and divine judgment. For Ibn Rushd, it preserved the dignity of reason. The highest part of us is not private ego, but participation in universal intellect. Our survival lies not in clinging to personal identity, but in merging with eternal knowledge. Necessity and contingency. Ibn Rushd's architecture of reality was structured by the balance of necessity and contingency. God exists necessarily. The world flows necessarily from God, but contains contingent arrangements. This tree, that event, this history. Within contingency, human beings exercise choice, guided by reason and law. This balance allowed him to defend both divine wisdom and human responsibility. Without necessity, the world would be chaos. Without contingency, human action would be meaningless. Ibn Rushd insisted, the structure of reality holds both. Time and eternity. Time for Ibn Rushd belongs to the motion of the heavens. The eternal world is not timeless, but ever-moving, ever-renewed. God stands beyond time, the eternal cause of time itself. Human beings, bound in temporal succession, glimpse eternity through intellect. To think demonstratively is to step momentarily out of time into eternal truth. The metaphysical ladder. His metaphysics can be seen as a ladder. 1. God, pure actuality, necessary being. 2. Heavens, eternal motions governed by intelligences. 3. Sublunar world, generation and corruption, contingency and change. 4. Human beings, composite creatures, bridging matter and intellect. The latter was Aristotelian, but Ibn Rushd defended it with relentless clarity against theologians who wanted miracle without order, creation without eternity, God without intelligibility. Consequences. This metaphysics sealed his fate in Islam, but made him immortal in Europe. The eternity of the world, the unity of the intellect, natural causation, these became the pillars of Averroism. To defenders, they were rational, inevitable, liberating. To enemies, they were heresy dressed as philosophy. In truth, Ibn Rushd's metaphysics was both, liberating in its rational clarity, heretical in its defiance of orthodoxy. But for him, the choice was no choice at all. If philosophy means demonstration, then these conclusions were necessary. To deny them was not humility, but betrayal of reason. Part 12. Psychology and the Soul. For Ibn Rushd, psychology was not a side project. It was the battlefield where questions of knowledge, immortality, and human dignity collided. How does the soul think? What survives death? Is individuality real or illusion? These were not abstract puzzles. They cut straight to theology, law, and destiny. Hashter layers of the soul. Following Aristotle's De Anima, Ibn Rushd saw the soul as a set of powers organized hierarchically. 1. Vegetative soul, nutrition, growth, reproduction, shared with plants. 2. Sensitive soul, perception, imagination, appetite, movement, shared with animals. 3. Rational soul, unique to humans, the capacity for thought and knowledge. The lower faculties serve the higher. The body provides matter, sensation provides images, imagination stores and manipulates them. But reason is the form that orders all. Imagination as bridge. Ibn Rushd gave special attention to imagination, mutakhayila. It mediates between sense perception and intellect, providing the phantasms that the intellect abstracts into universals. Without imagination, no thinking. Without body, no imagination. Psychology here ties metaphysics to physiology. Reason cannot float free, it needs flesh to feed it. Intellect dissected, but the true battlefield lay in the intellect. Aristotle had spoken of potential intellect and active intellect, but left their relation unclear. Ibn Rushd dissected them into sharp categories. Material intellect, aql hayulni, pure potentiality, the capacity for thought, one and the same for all humans. Passive intellect, aql bil malaka, the habituated intellect of an individual, prepared by education and practice. Active intellect, aqfal, the eternal, separate intellect that actualizes potential thought, illuminating forms. For him, the material intellect is not multiplied in individuals. It is universal, eternal, a single intellect shared by all. Individual minds participate in it temporarily, like lamps lit by the same flame. Immortality redefined. This doctrine, the unity of the material intellect, was dynamite. It meant your memories, imagination, personality die with the body. What endures is not you, but the universal intellect in which you shared. Immortality is participation, not personal survival. To theologians, this was annihilation of the afterlife. To Ibn Rushd, it was truth demonstrated. Philosophy cannot bend to comfort. Reason shows individuality is transient, intellect universal. If revelation speaks of personal resurrection, that belongs to rhetorical truth for the masses. For the philosopher, immortality means unity with eternal thought. Knowledge is abstraction. In practice, knowledge happens as follows. The senses provide data, imagination holds images, the material intellect abstracts universals from them, the active intellect actualizes those universals as intelligible forms. Thus, the soul rises from particular to universal, from body to intellect, from time to eternity. Law and psychology. Ibn Rushd's psychology also shaped his law. Since most people cannot rise above imagination and rhetoric, law must address them through images, parables, promises, and threats. Philosophy may reach the universals, but society runs on particulars. Sharia is not false. It is tailored truth, pedagogy for the masses, discipline for the city. Against mystical psychology, here Ibn Rushd diverged sharply from Sufis. For mystics, the soul ascends through visions, ecstasies, unveilings. For Ibn Rushd, that is rhetoric disguised as knowledge. True ascent is not emotional intoxication, but rational abstraction. Intellect, not vision, is the path to God. Where Ghazali spoke of light in the heart, Ibn Rushd spoke of form in the intellect. Aftershocks. The unity of intellect haunted Europe. Latin Averroists embraced it. One eternal intellect shared by all, the ultimate community of minds. Aquinas fought it tooth and nail, defending individual souls and personal immortality. The controversy raged for centuries, shaping scholastic psychology, feeding into Renaissance naturalism. In Islam, the doctrine was toxic. To deny individual immortality was to deny Quran and Hadith, to strip heaven and hell of meaning. Ibn Rushd's psychology was shelved, remembered more in heresy trials than in mosques. Lesson of the soul. Ibn Rushd's psychology left a hard lesson. Reason does not guarantee comfort. The truth of intellect may erase the consolations of individuality. Philosophy, if pursued to its end, forces us to choose between what is demonstrable and what is desirable. For Ibn Rushd, the choice was clear. Truth first, consolation later. Part 13. Political philosophy and the governance of souls. If psychology showed how the soul must be disciplined, politics showed how whole populations must be governed. For Ibn Rushd, the two were inseparable. The city is the soul writ large, the law its reason, rulers its intellect. His political philosophy was not utopian speculation. It was anchored in Aristotle, sharpened by Islamic jurisprudence, and tested by the brutal politics of Almohad rule. Law as pedagogy. For Ibn Rushd, the Sharia is a training system. Most people cannot rise to demonstrative knowledge. They need parables, commands, punishments, and rituals to guide their behavior and orient their souls. Law is thus pedagogy for the masses, securing order while pointing toward ultimate truths. But the philosopher sees beyond the literal. For him, law encodes rational aims, justice, order, virtue, even when clothed in rhetoric. The jurist who interprets law without philosophy is a grammarian who reads words but misses meaning. The philosopher-jurist sees law as rational architecture, scaffolding for the human spirit. Justice as balance. Drawing from Aristotle's Politics and Nicomachean Ethics, Ibn Rushd defined justice as balance, giving each what is due, arranging social roles so that the city functions as an ordered whole. Justice is not only legal fairness, but cosmic symmetry, society mirroring the harmony of the universe. Inequality is not injustice if it reflects natural differences in capacity. What matters is proper proportion. Philosophers ruling, soldiers defending, workers providing, all under law that directs each toward the common good. The philosopher-ruler. Here Ibn Rushd echoed Plato. The best city is ruled by philosophers. But unlike Plato, he did not dream of abolishing families or private property. He was more Aristotelian, realist, pragmatic. The philosopher-ruler is rare, perhaps impossible, under actual conditions. Therefore, law itself becomes the philosopher's substitute, a system of rules embodying reason, binding rulers and ruled alike. When philosophers do rule, they interpret revelation allegorically, govern according to demonstrative truth, and protect the masses with rhetorical religion. When they do not rule, the next best option is a political order where law is respected, philosophers are tolerated, and justice approximates balance. Religion and politics. Ibn Rushd rejected the idea that philosophy undermines religion. On the contrary, religion provides symbols that keep society cohesive, disciplines the passions, and orients the masses toward truth in forms they can handle. Philosophy is for the few, law and ritual for the many. Both are necessary. The state collapses if either is abandoned. This was not hypocrisy but hierarchy. Just as not all can be physicians, not all can be philosophers. But just as medicine heals bodies, law heals souls. The philosopher-legislator, like a physician of society, prescribes the regimen that keeps the city alive. Almohad context. These ideas were not mere abstractions. Ibn Rushd wrote under the Almohads, a Berber reform movement that rose by fire and sword, claiming to purify Islam. They imposed rigid doctrines, executed dissenters, and demanded conformity. Ibn Rushd tried to serve them as physician, judge, advisor. He argued for reason within a regime that feared it. Eventually, the Almohads turned on him, exiling him as heretic. His political theory was tested and found too rational for the irrational politics of his age. Women in the city. One of Ibn Rushd's most radical claims appears in his commentary on Plato's Republic. Women, he argued, share the same natural capacities as men and should be educated and employed as philosophers, soldiers, and rulers. Andalusian society wasted half its human capital by confining women to domestic roles. In this, he went further than Aristotle, aligning himself with Plato's daring vision. It was a rare flash of egalitarianism in an otherwise hierarchical system. Politics and happiness. For Ibn Rushd, the ultimate goal of politics is not wealth, conquest, or glory. It is happiness, sa'ada, defined as the perfection of the soul through knowledge and virtue. The city is good when it makes its citizens good, when it trains them not only to obey law, but to rise toward contemplation of truth. Politics is thus subordinate to philosophy, necessary because most cannot reach truth without it, valuable because it orders life toward the highest end. Failure and prophecy. In practice, Ibn Rushd knew that cities rarely achieve this ideal. Most regimes are corrupt, ruled by appetite or ambition, not reason. The philosopher's task is to mitigate harm, interpret law rationally, and guide rulers when possible. Prophets serve as philosopher-legislators, clothing truth in symbols for the masses. Philosophers continue their work in the shadows, sustaining truth through demonstration while society staggers along on rhetoric and coercion. Lesson of politics. Ibn Rushd's political philosophy left a paradox. He exalted reason, yet conceded that most humans cannot live by reason. He praised philosophy, yet accepted that law and rhetoric must rule. He hoped for philosopher rulers, yet lived under regimes that silenced him. His political theory, like his life, testified to the tension between truth and power. Reason sees what politics cannot bear. Part 14. Legacy and Transmission. Ibn Rushd died in 1198, aged 72, in Marrakesh. At his funeral, legend says his coffin was carried on one side of a mule, balanced on the other side by the many volumes of his writings. The image is perfect, a man outweighed by his own books, his body matched against the burden of thought. In the Islamic world, ironically, Ibn Rushd's name dimmed quickly in the Muslim East. The Almohads who once patronized him had exiled him, jurists distrusted him, mystics ignored him. In the Islamic heartlands, Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, his Aristotelianism found little purchase. Philosophy in its pure peripatetic form withered, displaced by theology, mysticism, and later currents of jurisprudence. Al-Ghazali's critique remained dominant. To most Muslim scholars, philosophy was suspect, dangerous, even heretical. Ibn Rushd was preserved more as a jurist in Maliki law than as the great commentator on Aristotle. His philosophical system did not shape Islamic orthodoxy. His influence was muted, even silenced. In Latin Christendom. But in Europe, his books detonated. Translated into Latin and Hebrew in the 13th century, they made him the commentator, the definitive interpreter of Aristotle. Thomas Aquinas called him that, not as insult but recognition. Whenever Aristotle spoke, Ibn Rushd explained. Paris, Padua, Bologna, All the medieval universities pulsed with his voice. Averroism became a badge of daring thought, the eternity of the world, the unity of the intellect, the autonomy of reason. Condemned in 1270 and 1277 by Parisian bishops, Averroism refused to die. It seeded the Renaissance, sharpened debates about reason and faith, prepared the ground for secular philosophy. The double legacy. Thus Ibn Rushd became a paradox, marginalized at home, central abroad. In Islam, the philosopher who defended the harmony of faith and reason was exiled and forgotten. In Christianity, the Muslim judge who never abandoned revelation was recast as champion of pure reason. His system was both distorted and preserved, rejected and canonized. Rationalism and revolt. What Europe absorbed most was his confidence in reason's autonomy. The idea that philosophy could stand on its own legs, without bowing to theology, inspired centuries of thinkers. Dante placed Ibn Rushd among the virtuous pagans in the Divine Comedy. Renaissance humanists revered him. Enlightenment rationalists claimed him. By then, he was more European than Andalusian, why he faded in Islam. Several reasons explain his eclipse in Muslim lands. First, the political context. Philosophy had no safe patrons after the Almohads fell. Second, the theological climate. Ash'ari occasionalism dominated, leaving little room for Aristotelian necessity. Third, the rise of Sufism. Mysticism satisfied spiritual hunger in ways dry demonstration could not. Ibn Rushd's austere rationalism seemed bloodless compared to Rumi's ecstasy or Ibn Arabi's visions. The enduring lesson, yet his deeper lesson survives. Ibn Rushd insisted that truth is one, that reason and revelation do not contradict, that philosophy is not enemy but ally of faith. His failure in Islam and success in Europe show the fragility of intellectual climates. Ideas flourish not only by their merit, but by the soil in which they fall. Today he is claimed by many. Secular rationalists hail him as proto-enlightenment, Muslim reformers as forgotten champion of reason, jurists as faithful Maliki scholar, philosophers as the last great Aristotelian of Islam. Each is partly right, partly blind. The full Ibn Rushd resists capture, philosopher, judge, physician, exile, coffin and books. That mule bearing his coffin and books remains the truest image. On one side, the man, finite, fragile, persecuted, mortal. On the other, his writings, weightier, durable, carried across seas, translated into tongues he never spoke, influencing worlds he never saw. His life ended in obscurity, but his words traveled further than he could have imagined. Final word. Ibn Rushd's story closes with this irony. In defending philosophy within Islam, he lost. In offering philosophy to Christendom, he triumphed. His legacy is divided, but his principle remains. Reason, properly used, is not the enemy of faith, but its perfection. Whether embraced or rejected, remembered or forgotten, Ibn Rushd remains the bridge between two civilizations, the man who tried to make truth whole. Part 15. The Enduring Bridge. Every philosopher dies twice, once in body, once in memory. Ibn Rushd's first death came in 1198, his body carried home from Marrakesh to Cordoba. His second never arrived. His memory refuses to vanish, suspended between two worlds that claimed and denied him. The unity of truth. For Ibn Rushd, the ultimate conviction was simple but radical. Truth is one. Revelation, philosophy, science, and law cannot contradict in their essence, because reality itself does not split. Apparent conflicts are misunderstandings, of scripture, of reasoning, or of method. The Quran invites reflection. Philosophy fulfills the invitation. To reject reason is to betray revelation itself. The method. His method was austere. Demonstration for the elite, dialectic for the trained, rhetoric for the masses. Each has its place, none can be eliminated. Philosophy clarifies, law regulates, religion binds, politics orders. He carved domains, respected limits, and demanded hierarchy. This was not elitism for vanity, but pedagogy. Society survives when each soul receives the nourishment it can digest. The failure. Yet he failed in his time. The jurists branded him dangerous, the mystics found him cold, the rulers feared his independence. He defended philosophy within Islam and lost. The soil of his age could not sustain him. His books were more enduring than his patronage. His name faded in the East even as it exploded in the West. The triumph, but ideas migrate. What Cordoba silenced, Paris amplified. What Marrakesh buried, Padua resurrected. Ibn Rushd became the commentator, shaping scholasticism, stirring Renaissance debates, feeding the veins of European rationalism. His words, detached from his faith, lived a second life in another civilization. The lesson, his paradox, teaches a hard truth. Ideas survive not merely by their brilliance, but by the climates that host them. Reason needs institutions, courage needs patrons, philosophy needs freedom. Ibn Rushd provided the arguments, but his world provided no shelter. Europe, for a time, did. Today, 9 centuries later, his questions remain. Can faith and reason coexist without mutilating each other? Can philosophy survive in climates that distrust its freedom? Can truth be spoken to power without exile? Ibn Rushd's life answers with both hope and warning. Yes, but at cost. The bridge. He stands finally as a bridge between Aristotle and Aquinas, Islam and Christendom, revelation and reason. A bridge is not a home, it is a passage. Ibn Rushd himself was never fully at home in either camp, but he enabled others to cross. That is his destiny, his tragedy, and his greatness.